Many of us might be well aware that there is a high level of education in the OECD or the industrialized countries, and there's a rising level of education in the developing countries. When we started the semester, I think one of the most surprising things to most students in the class is that the average number of years of schooling in India still happens to be around 6 years of schooling, which is effectively an elementary education. What that means is that there are many people in India, older people, who are not educated. Hopefully, the numbers show us that the expected years of schooling is rising, so that if you happen to be a young person now, the level of schooling that you expect to complete is much higher than the average in these developing countries. Certainly in the case of India, we see this number rising. This is a very good thing. Before we get too far into the game, I want you to be aware of who the big names are in this subject. Well, at least one big name. And I would tell you that the year that Arthur Lewis won the Nobel Prize for his contributions to economic development, he was the co-winner with an individual who focused on human capital. And this was Theodore Schultz. Ted Schultz was a professor at the University of Chicago, and we may have mentioned him earlier. I think we did mention him earlier. Ted Schultz gave a speech when he was the president of the American Economic Association, and obviously based on his life's work, he thought that education was the better investment to be made in these developing countries. This is, at this point, a controversial topic when Schultz is making this argument, because we're talking about coming out from colonialism and trying to make advances in the world. Most theories that we looked at, and most development economists that you would pay attention to back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, would have emphasized an investment in physical infrastructure and physical capital. Schultz came along and emphasized an investment in human capital. In other words, education. Education and health, the well-being of your citizenry for the future. So you're raising your labor from unskilled labor to skilled labor. Again, a tough argument to make, because the agencies that had funding to help development thought that the countries needed physical infrastructure. They needed airports and seaports and hospitals and schools, but certainly you want the physical infrastructure because you could lend money and expect a quick return on the investment. In fact, the best investment in those days was viewed as an investment that started to pay dividends very, very quickly. So an airport or a seaport would clearly pay dividends very quickly because it would facilitate transportation of people and goods into the country, and therefore make the commercial and the economic side of things much better and much faster. Investment in education would take time. Investment in health would also take time. If you're investing in the health of young people, it would take a while for them to move through the educational system and grow to maturity before we would see the benefit being redounded to the rest of society. So the return to capital, physical capital, was going to be faster than the return to human capital. Human capital would pay dividends for a long time, whereas the physical capital will pay its dividends very quickly and for a shorter period of time. You could jumpstart your economy and get high rates of growth by investing in physical capital. You could invest in human capital and not see any return for a long time. So this was the challenge. Of course, depending on where you invested in the human capital. If you invested in elementary education, again, you'd have to wait 12 years for these individuals to reach adulthood, and therefore you weren't expecting to see any great significant return there. If instead you invested in tertiary education, then you would see some pretty quick returns. However, what you were doing is making an investment that would only increase income inequality very quickly, because you'd be investing in the people who succeeded through the school system to give them tertiary education. Remember, this is a pipeline, so in order to get to tertiary, you had to succeed at secondary. And also what would happen is that instead of allowing individuals to go abroad now for their tertiary education, the small percentage that would have gotten it, 5% of the economy at most, you're now telling them that they can stay at home and attain this tertiary education, but also you could expand the tertiary education to go beyond that 5%, because frequently the opportunities to go abroad for education were so few that having the tertiary education at home would expand the capacity very quickly for the country. So this is a quick start. Investment in education. Education for whom and education for what? In fact, the whole idea of university education is something to be curious about. If you go back in the history, when universities first started, you would see that there was not much practical being taught in universities. It was classics, it was literature, it was training for the priesthood, and a few other things. Most professions were not educational institution bound, so the law, you didn't have to go to college to get a law degree. You certainly didn't go to college to get an accounting credential, and in the commercial sector, you were an apprentice and then you made your way up. Medicine, perhaps you went to school, but many things you could just get through without having to go to school. So certainly for lawyers, you would just write exams. The exams would be administered obviously by the institution that would admit you to the bar, but it was not necessarily a school-based education. So as you think that through, the origin of education as we understand it, you will see that we now provide so much education to so many people and many subjects that never would have been taught back in the old days when education was scarce, tertiary education. So imagine you are the new leader of a country, or the leader of a new country, I should say, and you are thinking, okay, we have a few $1 million to invest. Where should we invest it? Should we invest it in better primary education, or should we invest it in a tertiary institution? Because these countries lack managerial capacity, certainly the more people you could train quickly to become managers, the better you could marshal your resources for growth. Immediate or reasonably immediate growth. I should say reasonably quick growth. Getting the people trained effectively so that they could fix what ailed the country. So how did countries deal with this? Well, some countries decided to invest in elementary education, the long view, and others decided to expand tertiary education. Many did both, and therefore had to stretch their dollars between these two different avenues. So as we think about the education that we would want to provide at a, say, tertiary level, the question became which subjects would be priority and which ones were easier to deliver. Certainly medicine is a priority, but then how many doctors do you actually need and how many people do you have, and do you want to provide the education yourself versus continuing to send these individuals to prestigious institutions so that you could economize on your resources. Suppose it took $100,000 to train a doctor for 3 years or 4 years. I'm just making the numbers up, okay? But for that $100,000, you could train 30 lawyers. Should you send the doctors abroad to be trained and train the lawyers at home? Or should you split the resources between law and medicine? Or should you focus on medicine and let the people who want law go abroad? Let's go back to Theodore Schultz. Theodore Schultz, in his presidential address to the American Economic Association, changed the landscape or the thinking when he said that we should invest in education rather than physical capital, because in looking down the road, these countries would benefit more from a higher educated workforce, and that was a sea change in the thinking. Borrowing international funds for capital investment, you'd have to pay back in international currency, and certainly if you invested it in some industry that would either save you on imports or promote your exports, the loan could be serviced relatively easily. Hopefully you're starting to see that education is tricky, because if you're borrowing the money and you have to pay it back in international currency, there is no quick solution to paying this money back in international currency. Your export sectors need to be firing sufficiently well so that they're earning enough foreign exchange so that you don't create a second problem as you invest in human capital. Clearly something to think about. I would like for you to take a look at the data then on education around the world. So look at the Human Development Report that's available to see what the level of schooling is in these various countries, certainly these various parts of the world, so that we have a better sense as to what is going on. One of the things that's important to me is to help you to get the theory behind investing in education. And I will tell you that the theory we will look at mostly will be a supply-based theory. In other words, we supply more education, assuming that these individuals will then use the education the same way we supply more machines, expecting the machines to do what we need to get done. If you're going to invest in education, and like the migration topic, too many people take the education, and then there are not enough jobs for these individuals, then the education is wasteful. It is a Harris-Tudaro kind of scenario where you educate too many people who will then be or underemployed in their field for which they just trained. Countries need to be very careful about this. So let's go back to the idea where a country is establishing a university for the first time, and it's trying to figure out what subjects it should concentrate on. Certainly art history, psychology, humanities might not jump to the top of the preference table. If you establish these areas and these individuals graduate and can't find a job in their field, then it would have proven to be a not so good investment. So I'll tell you a quick story about the university I went to, my undergraduate alma mater, the University of the West Indies. It started with one campus in Jamaica. It was to serve all of the Caribbean countries that were English-speaking mostly, that were part of the West Indies. Remember when I started out, I told you how Britain gave the West Indies independence in 1958 as a single entity, and then Jamaica withdrew from the Federation, Trinidad and Tobago withdrew from the Federation, and the Federation effectively broke up, and then the individual countries sought political independence on their own. So you have 13 different states as opposed to one nation that was a federal government. However, the educational institution that was founded was called the University of the West Indies, and it had one campus in Jamaica. And then they added a campus in Trinidad, and that campus had to figure out where is our comparative advantage going to be. Because Trinidad is an oil-rich country, they decided that petroleum-related subjects and engineering-related subjects were their forte. So Trinidad focused heavily on engineering and agriculture. Jamaica focused on medicine. That's the first location for medicine in the Caribbean. And then Barbados got a campus, and their specialty was law. So you're still supplying all of the general education subjects, arts and sciences, etc. But each campus then got a specialization to prevent duplicating the specializations when the population was thin, and the governments could afford to send the few individuals they needed in these fields to the campus where this was supplied. So let's go back to the theory. It is going to be a supply-based theory, and we're going to assume that the supply of education will provide useful benefits to the society. And we're going to look at the individual's behavior in investing in the education and society's role in investing in the education. If you keep a gendered perspective on education, I think you'll get a good segue into the nitty-gritty or the nuts and bolts of the topic. So as you look at the human capital theory of investment, I would like for you to start with the age earnings profile. So we're going to assume that as individuals attain a higher level of education, they're going to get benefits from this education, and the benefits will be the financial reward they get per year. But we want to look at the total amount of benefit they get. So the net present value of the benefits. Aggregate all of the benefits for the rest of their work life, and obviously weight it based on the interest rate or the rate of return in a present value sense, so that we are adjusting for inflation in real dollars, constant dollars. And then we ask, so what is the net present value of the stream of benefits to come for the period? So one of the things I like to do is to keep the numbers simple. Assume the individual graduates college at 22 and works to 62, so we have a nice 40-year work life. And we ask, what return are they going to get? Suppose they're getting a 3%. Okay, let's go higher. A 10% rate of return per year on that. So in real terms, so you have a 10% over 40 years. And then ask the question, what did it cost to educate the individual? Notice that all of the costs are going to be squished into 4 years, whereas the benefits are going to be over 40 years. So we have a lot of costs upfront and a slow stream of benefits. But we're going to assume that in net present value terms, the net benefit, the present value of the benefit minus the present value of the cost, must be a positive. Otherwise, the individual would not make the investment. That is a necessary condition for investing in the education. But positive is not enough. If you have a set of funds that you could invest in one area and you choose to invest it in another area, the area you choose should pay a higher benefit than the area you don't choose, opportunity cost. So if the individual can take the lump sum, call it a loan or call it a gift, the lump sum of money they had that they were going to spend on the education, they would also consider spending that money on an alternative investment and then looking over the life of the investment to see which investment would pay better. So it is not enough for the net benefit to be positive. It must be sufficiently positive and greater than alternative investments for it to be a meaningful investment. Okay, let's add a gender twist to this. Should you invest in your daughters the same way you invest in your sons? This is the crux of the theory and the application that I want you to focus on. So I'd like for you to apply this to the little girl in India, in Rajasthan, the little girl named Neeraj. Neeraj was about 9 or 10 years old, and her mother and father were thinking, who should we invest in? Clearly, if you only have enough to invest in one child and you have 2 children, you toss a coin, or you invest in the first one, or you invest in the smarter one. Let's go back to the gendered perspective. If you have a daughter and a son, who do you invest in? Invest in the son. That's just the reality in many of these poorer countries. So you invest in educating your son, and if your daughter has to be married off into another family, as in India, and there has to be a dowry to help you transition her into that new family, then clearly daughters are not viewed as assets in the same way that sons are viewed as assets. So the investment in the son will pay a greater net benefit, ceteris paribus. Of course, as you think about the fact that women exit the labor market historically for family formation reasons, then you would see that a female is likely to have a shorter work life than a male. Therefore, the stream of benefits to a male's educational investment would be more continuous and probably greater than the stream of benefits to a female's education. This is not even considering the idea of gender discrimination. So this is pre-labor market discrimination by a parent about who to invest in. And this is not considering the fact that 2 qualified individuals, equally qualified in the labor market, the employer might choose to discriminate against the female, equally qualified or even better qualified, because the employer thinks of other reasons why the investment in the male might be better. So suppose the employer is going to offer training to 2 new graduates, male and female. The employer would like to get a 30-year return on his investment. And if he thinks that the female is likely to exit the labor market for 5 or 10 years to have and rear children, then clearly he's going to say the female is not as good an investment as the male. And this has happened in pretty much every culture historically. In fact, as you look at the history of America, married women did not generally work. When you got married, you left the labor force and you came home and you formed your family. So it's not too far to go back to a world when there was gender discrimination in the labor market. But even prior to the discrimination in the labor market, there was pre-labor market gender discrimination by families. I hope you get the idea there. 2 forms of discrimination. One in the labor market by the employer, and the other one in the household by the parents. So look at the story of Neeraj, and in the documentary Time for School, they followed Neeraj from the time she is, say, 9 or 10, up to the point where she is in her 20s and married, so you'll get a sense as to how this works out. There are many good stories in that documentary. I'd like for you to pay attention to them. In fact, I've offered some extra credit if you would make that your first priority to look at the Time for School documentary, think about it, and that will be an open forum so everybody can participate at the same time. Obviously, to participate, you should have watched the documentary. Otherwise, you're not adding value to the conversation. So as you look at the Moodle page, what you will see concerning the Time for School documentary is the following. There's a video segment on Neeraj's story. It starts when she is 9 or 10. Then we have another young lady in Afghanistan, a Muslim country, well, a lot more than a Muslim country, and she is struggling to get an education. To fast forward the story, Sugarfoot is going to become a doctor, but there are struggles along the way. Then there's Joab and Ken. We're looking at Brazil and Kenya. We're looking to see how individuals are struggling with education in Africa and Latin America. And then there are a few other stories in there that you want to pay attention to. So give the documentary some of your attention, and just to formulate your thoughts, how families are making decisions and how societies are making decisions about education. One of the things in this chapter on education and health that I found intriguing was the focus on non-governmental organizations. Suppose it's an international NGO. Why is the NGO going to a developing country? What is it trying to provide? Since the topic is education and health, mainly education, let us think about NGOs that come to supply education to these developing countries. What kind of education would an NGO come to supply? Clearly, a profit-seeking institution would go for the area where more profits can be made. So it would provide private education for maybe wealthier people, or tertiary education on a fee basis. An NGO, a non-governmental organization, might come in and provide education for the disadvantaged. And this is not a difficult equation to understand. So imagine society is going to invest in one of two children. One of them is physically handicapped. The other is able-bodied. It should be clear the country would view that investing in the able-bodied individual would be a better investment for society. An NGO might come into the country and decide to invest in the handicapped person because its concern is a little different. It's not profit-seeking. It's not trying to maximize the country's social welfare. It's trying to make sure that individuals have dignity, that everyone has some dignity. So it would go and provide education for the individuals that the society might consider less than desirable for this education. Again, that should make sense. So one of the foci or focuses that I added to the chapter is Catholic schools in India, or I have experience with the Salvation Army's schools around the world. So the Salvation Army has thousands of schools around the world in the developing countries, meeting a need that this society does not view as a high priority. As you think that through then, what needs will they meet? Handicapped, physically disabled, the throwaway, so to speak, in the society. That is who you'd be trying to provide educational opportunities and training opportunities for. So it's kind of a social justice agenda for the NGOs to come in and offer educational services or health services or other services on a non-fee basis rather than on a fee-paying basis. So closer to the start of this talk, I mentioned the idea of investing in a product or process that if the funds that you borrow are internationally provided, you want to make sure that these funds get repaid in international currency, so you want to invest in something that is going to earn foreign exchange. And in this chapter, I want you to focus heavily on India. I chose to focus more heavily on India, and I mentioned two stylized facts. One is that Indians in America, individuals born in India, living in America, constitute the highest earning income group in America, but India is still a poor country. Think that through for a moment. So India's brightest and best are seeking to leave after the Indian society has paid for their education. They're coming to America, the land of opportunity, where they know they can compete with the brightest and best from all over the world. Should the society then make investments in individuals who will actually leave and not repay the society in kind or in cash for the investments the society made? How do you hold individuals in your country when you've educated them at the state's expense and now they're going to pick up and leave because there are better opportunities abroad. Question to think about. One of the things you will see as you look at the segments on India is how India's brightest and best end up in America's best schools, but they can't get into India's best schools. So spend a lot of time thinking about the educational investment from a gendered perspective, and then move on from the gendered perspective to other perspectives, because I think if you get the gendered perspective, you will see how the investment can turn south if you are investing in a female versus a male. And I want to ask you on your test certainly questions about how society will fix what a family has chosen. So in the case of Neeraj, her mother said, why would you educate your daughter? She's going to marry off into another family, so educate your sons. But even when you educate your sons, there might not be a job for them. So why waste any money on your daughter? Again, this is a lady you might consider not to be educated, perpetuating a cycle where I'm not educated, my daughter's not going to get an education, she has chores to do, plus she's going to leave the family, so any investment we make in her would go to her husband's family, so we don't get the return. So the family is looking out for its own welfare, and think about the fact that children may have been their parents' social security, and male children, more likely, if they would inherit their father's agricultural business or estate or status, that if they hang around the family because the family invested more in the son, then the son would become the caregiver to his ailing parents, or his wife would actually. So that was part of the society, and that's part of the culture, something to think about. I would also like you to think of China, a communist country, and how China is solving its educational dilemmas. China has become the world's factory. India is trying to become the world's IT center. Clearly you need more education for IT than you do for manufacturing. So China does not have to invest in education the way India has chosen, because China is not looking for that same kind of industry or same kind of return. Those of you who focused on the lack of success of the migration, individuals moving to urban areas and not succeeding in getting a job in the urban formal sector, would also think of individuals who got a good education but ended up not using their education and had to settle for a lower paying job or a less prestigious job outside of their areas of specialization. The example that would have come up in the prior chapter would be the case where many Indian college graduates end up working in call centers, certainly when they're young. So a job that would be done in America by a non-college graduate is being done by a college graduate in India. Why was that? Well, it was partly because the salaries were attractive, and the culture was a young culture in terms of the individuals you're working with. They need to be able to speak English well enough. They need to interact with individuals in America and other industrialized countries on the phone, so they needed to be sufficiently educated. So as you look at that story, keep that in mind. Is the education useful or is it wasteful? Where is the stopping point? If you supply education for all, at what point is the society making a not so great investment? Education for all. How much education? So society needs to think through these things and recognize that in order to supply the education, you need to build the infrastructure. One of the things you will see is that in India, they had to incent the teachers to go to work, because the teachers would get paid even if they didn't go to work, so they had to create a new system to force these teachers to go to work. So hopefully you understand the gendered perspective on education, and the conclusion coming out of that would be, since a family would be less likely to invest in their daughter's education, if society wanted the female to be educated, then it was up to society to subsidize the female's education. If the society paid more to a male graduate than a female graduate, then the labor market would have to fix that, but the labor market is not interested in solving that, taking care of the cheaper labor, so the society would have to intervene and fix that as well. Legislation or big state politics to force equality in the labor market. Of course, we can't call it irrational if the employer says, well, if she's going to be gone 6 months out of the next year, maybe she should not be the one getting the promotion because the work needs to go on when she is not here. That's how that discrimination continued to work. So as we go back to the urban areas and think through the supply of education, certainly in India, ask the question, where these individuals who are falling off the radar, so to speak, because of their poverty and their lack of opportunity, where they're going to find the funds to send their children to school. And if you come to the urban area, you can't get into a school, how are you going to fix what ails your situation? So in the reading and the video watching, you will see stories that would help you to understand how this works or does not work. To connect the chapter to the prior chapter, we want to look at the development of schools in slum areas for poorer people. That's a nice perspective to have as you think through this topic. There's some content in the textbook that I need for you to pay close attention to. And I will ask you questions about the social versus private benefit. So society getting the benefit versus the individual getting the benefit. The difference between social benefit and private benefit. The social cost and private cost. So society subsidizes your education. That's part of the social cost. What you pay is the private cost. If society is going to subsidize education for all, we expect more people to get education because the costs are going down and the benefits are staying the same, ceteris paribus. So the net benefit is larger. If the benefit were to go down, society would have to intervene to prevent people from changing their minds about education. As the costs rise, people would, again, decide to vote with their feet and leave education, and society may have to subsidize those that want to stay in education. So as you look at the human capital chapter, make sure that you have studied figures 8.1 and 8.2 and table 8.1. Very important for your text. Figures 8.1 and 8.2 and table 8.1. After you've focused on the material I just mentioned, you want to make sure that you study figure 8.6 and read the content around that as well. That would pretty much summarize where I want for you to be in this chapter. So between the documentary and the age earnings profiles and the rates of return, the social and private rates of return to education, that would constitute what I need for you to know from this chapter. So, take care.